When your manipulative ex asks to meet for closure, just say no. I didn't, and I found myself in a designer suit I couldn't afford, across from a man I no longer recognized. The only thing that saved me? My terrifying, enigmatic, and apparently very observant mafia boss, who happened to be watching the whole pathetic ordeal from across the room. I smoothed the buttery fabric of my yellow dress one last time, my reflection shimmering in the polished brass of the Belmont Club's revolving door. Inside, crystal chandeliers dripped light onto plush leather and dark mahogany, a world of quiet power and old money. It had been 3 silent months since I walked out of 𝘍𝙍𝙁𝙁's apartment, and tonight was the final step. Not for him, but for me. Working as a maid for the Castellano family had given me more than a steady paycheck. It had given me routine, dignity, and a profound sense of peace. This meeting wasn't about forgiveness. It was about closing a chapter for good. 𝘍𝙍𝙁 was already at a corner table, the picture of practiced charm in a burgundy suit I knew he couldn't afford. He stood as I approached, his smile the same one that had once captivated me and later became a mask for his control. "Rita, you look stunning." He ordered a bottle of wine with a name I couldn't pronounce and a price tag that made my stomach clench. It was a classic 𝘍𝙍𝙁 performance, creating an illusion of success to hide the desperation underneath. As he began his well-rehearsed speech of apologies and second chances, I felt the familiar prickle of being watched. It wasn't the casual glance of a curious diner, but a heavy, focused gaze that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. Across the opulent lounge, in a secluded booth, 4 men were engaged in a low, serious conversation. Yet one of them, the epicenter of the group's gravity, had his attention fixed entirely on our table. Donald "Don" Castellano, my employer. At the estate, he was an almost mythical figure, a man whose presence was felt in the respectful silence that fell whenever he entered a room. But seeing him here in his element was entirely different. He wore a sharp, dark green suit, his presence so commanding it seemed to suck the air from his vicinity. It was his eyes, though amber, intelligent, and predatory, that held me captive. I dropped my gaze, a nervous heat rising in my cheeks, and tried to focus on 𝘍𝙍𝙁's empty words. My phone buzzed, a welcome interruption from the estate's head housekeeper. "I need to take this," I said, cutting 𝘍𝙍𝙁 off mid-sentence. I escaped toward the lobby, grateful for the chance to breathe. The call was over in a minute, but when I returned, the atmosphere at our table had curdled. The ambient murmur of the club seemed to have receded, leaving us in a pocket of charged silence. 𝘍𝙍𝙁 sat stiffly, a sheen of sweat on his brow, and standing beside my chair, holding my wine glass by its delicate stem, was Donald Castellano. Up close, he was even more imposing. He radiated a lethal stillness, a controlled power that was both terrifying and, strangely, reassuring. His man in the green suit now loomed near the fireplace, another near the bar, their positions seamlessly cutting off all escape routes. The entire room had been subtly and swiftly brought under his command. My heart hammered against my ribs. "What's going on?" Don Castellano's amber eyes met mine, and for a split second, their intensity softened. "I wouldn't drink this if I were you," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He placed my glass back on the table with surgical precision. His gaze flicked to 𝘍𝙍𝙁, turning to ice. "Your companion added something to it while you were away." The words took a moment to land. Then, a cold dread washed through me. "What?" 𝘍𝙍𝙁 shot to his feet, his face ashen. "He's insane, Rita. I have no idea what he's talking about. Let's just go. Sit down." The command wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a blade. 𝘍𝙍𝙁 collapsed back into his chair as if his strings had been cut. Don's attention was now a physical force pinning 𝘍𝙍𝙁 to his seat. "I watched you. The moment she walked away, you pulled a small vial from your jacket pocket. You poured the contents into her wine and stirred it with her spoon." He paused, his voice dropping even lower. "Did you really think no one would see?" Panic flashed in 𝘍𝙍𝙁's eyes. "I didn't. He's lying, Rita, you know me." "Then prove it," Don said, his tone chillingly calm. He gestured toward the glass. "Drink." The entire lounge had fallen silent. Every eye was on our table. Abel stared at the glass as if it were filled with poison. "I'm not drinking her wine," he stammered. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Don's hand moved, pointing his chin slightly toward a nearby table where a well-dressed man, a man I now recognized as a regular visitor to the Castellano estate, watched them intently. "That man is a police detective. I can have him over here in 5 seconds. You can either drink the wine you seem so confident is safe, or you can explain your actions to him." Cornered, Abel began to tremble. His eyes darted around the room, finding no escape. He looked at Don's men, then at me, his expression pleading. In that moment of desperation, he lunged, not for the door, but for me, trying to grab my arm to use me as a shield. But 3 months of rebuilding my strength, of reclaiming my life, surged through me. I twisted away instinctively, a self-defense move I hadn't practiced in years, sending him stumbling back. Before he could recover, Don's men were on him, hauling him to his feet. "Take him downstairs," Don ordered, his voice devoid of emotion. "Find out what he used, and who he's working for." As they dragged a protesting Abel from the room, the spell broke, and a low murmur rippled through the lounge. My legs felt weak, my hands shaking uncontrollably as the reality of what just almost happened crashed over me. Don Castellano turned to me, his expression unreadable as he pulled out the chair across from mine and sat down. "Are you all right, Rita?" The simple question nearly shattered my composure. "I don't know," I whispered. Why did you?" A flicker of something, regret, perhaps, passed through his eyes. "It's my business to notice things, and I've been noticing Abel for months. The calls he made to the estate, the times he waited near the service entrance. I knew who he was to you." His gaze met mine, direct and unwavering. "Tonight, I simply made sure he couldn't hurt you." His words hung in the air between us, heavy and unbelievable. I stared at him, trying to connect the dots. The Don Castellano I knew was a phantom in his own home. A deep voice from behind a closed study door. A fleeting glimpse of a tailored suit jacket disappearing into a waiting car. He was a man of immense, quiet power who, as far as I knew, wouldn't have been able to pick me out of a lineup of his own staff. Yet he was telling me he'd been noticing things. Noticing Abel. Noticing me. "You knew," I finally managed, my voice thin and reedy. "You knew he was bothering me?" "I knew a rejected suitor was failing to take a hint," he corrected, his tone precise. "There is a significant difference between that and what happened tonight. What he attempted to do crosses a line from pathetic to predatory." He motioned to a waiter who had been hovering nervously nearby. "Bring a bottle of water for Ms. James. And my car." The command was absolute. My mind, still reeling from the adrenaline and the near miss with whatever was in that glass, struggled to catch up. "Your car? I can take a cab. I'm fine." Don's gaze was unwavering, and in it, I saw the futility of arguing. "You are not fine, Rita. And you are certainly not going back to your apartment tonight." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of fact, as indisputable as the solid mahogany of the table between us. A cold knot of fear, entirely different from the fear Abel had inspired, tightened in my stomach. I had just escaped one man's control only to be seamlessly handed into another's. "I can't just leave," I protested weakly, the words sounding hollow even to my own ears. "My things." "Your things will be retrieved for you," he said, standing as a dark-suited man, the one who had been by the fireplace, approached and murmured something in his ear. Don nodded once. "The car is here. Let's go." He didn't offer me his hand. He simply turned and started walking toward the exit, fully expecting me to follow. And I did. My legs felt disconnected from my body as I trailed in his wake, a small boat caught in the pull of a battleship. The other patrons of the Belmont Club averted their eyes, pretending to be deeply engrossed in their conversations. Their food, anything other than the quiet display of power that had just unfolded. Outside, the city air was cool against my flushed skin. A sleek, black sedan, so polished it looked like a shard of obsidian, idled at the curb. The driver held the back door open. Don gestured for me to get in before sliding in beside me. The door closed with a heavy, final-sounding thud, sealing us in a cocoon of rich leather and absolute silence. The car pulled away from the curb with impossible smoothness. We drove through the glittering city, the lights of Chicago painting streaks across the tinted windows. The silence inside the car was a living thing, thick with my unspoken questions and his unreadable composure. He didn't look at me. He stared straight ahead, his profile carved from stone, his hands resting on his knees. I, on the other hand, couldn't stop the trembling in my own hands. I clasped them tightly in my lap, focusing on the rhythmic pattern of the streetlights passing by. After what felt like an eternity, the car glided to a stop in a private underground garage. We were led to a private elevator that opened not into a hallway, but directly into an apartment that took my breath away. It was less an apartment and more a sky palace. One entire wall was a sheet of glass, offering a panoramic, godlike view of the city skyline. The furniture was minimalist and modern. A low-slung gray sofa, a glass coffee table, polished chrome accents, all clearly chosen for their aesthetic perfection rather than comfort. It was stunning, sterile, and utterly soulless. It was a gilded cage. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the cavernous space. "A secure location," Don answered, shrugging off his suit jacket and draping it over the back of a chair. "You'll be safe here." The shock of the evening was finally beginning to wear off, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. "Safe from 𝘿, maybe, but what about you? Why are you doing this?" My voice gained a sliver of strength. "You say you knew he was bothering me. How could you possibly know anything about me?" He walked over to a wet bar in the corner, pouring 2 glasses of water with steady hands. He brought one to me, his fingers brushing mine as I took it. A jolt like static electricity shot up my arm. "Because it is my responsibility to know what happens on my property and to my people," he said, taking a sip from his own glass. "I know 𝘿 called the main house line 17 times in the last month asking for you. I know he tried to question the kitchen staff about your work schedule. I know he sent a bouquet of lilies to the service entrance 2 weeks ago, and that you instructed the staff to throw them in the trash." Each sentence was a blow, stripping away another layer of my privacy. He spoke of my life with a clinical detachment that was more terrifying than any threat. He hadn't just noticed. He had been watching. I sank onto the edge of the sofa, the glass trembling in my hand. "You were spying on me." "I was ensuring the security of my estate," he countered, his voice remaining level. "𝘿 became a variable I needed to track." He paused, his amber eyes locking onto mine. "I also know that you went to the courthouse 3 weeks ago and filed for a restraining order against him. An order you never had served." The breath left my lungs. That was impossible. No one knew that. I had told no one, ashamed that it had gotten to that point, ashamed that I had lost my nerve and never followed through. "How?" was all I could manage to say. "It doesn't matter how I know, Rita. What matters is that I saw you were handling it. You left him, you blocked his number, you filed the order. You were taking the correct steps, and I respect a person who fights their own battles." He set his glass down on the bar. "But what he did tonight, drugging your wine in a public place, that was an escalation. He stopped being a pathetic ex-boyfriend and became a direct threat. And I do not tolerate threats against people under my protection." A dizzying mix of emotions swirled within me. Gratitude, raw and overwhelming, fought against a profound sense of violation. He had saved me, of that there was no doubt. But the safety he offered came at the cost of my autonomy, my privacy. He had seen my struggle and had chosen to remain a silent observer until he, and he alone, decided the rules had changed. I looked at him, truly looked at him, trying to reconcile the man who paid my salary with the man who could dismantle a person's life in a quiet lounge without raising his voice. The enigmatic boss I served coffee to was gone. In his place was a calculating protector, a man who moved pieces on a board I never even knew I was playing on. "So what happens now?" I asked, my voice shaking. Am I your prisoner? A flicker of something, was it surprise? Amusement? Crossed his face. You are my guest. You will stay here until I am certain the threat from 𝘿𝙍𝙎𝙁, and anyone he may be working with, is neutralized. Your job at the estate will be waiting for you. Your regular pay will be deposited. You are not a prisoner, Rita. You are protected. He walked toward the elevator. There is food in the kitchen. The bedroom is through that door. A man will be stationed outside in the hall. The only person he will allow to enter is me. The elevator doors slid open. He stepped inside, turning to face me one last time. Get some rest, Rita. We have much to discuss tomorrow. The doors slid shut, and I was left alone in the vast, silent apartment. I stood there for a long time, staring at the closed elevator, my protector and my captor all in one. The city lights twinkled outside the window, a million lives moving on as if nothing had happened. But my life had just been irrevocably altered. I was safe, but I had never felt less free. The silence of the gilded cage was deafening. I slept in fits and starts, haunted by the ghost of what could have been. Each time I drifted off, I saw 𝘿𝙍𝙎𝙁's face, the practiced charm curdling into a desperate snarl. I saw the small vial in his hand, the swirl of poison in my wine. And then, I would see Don Castellano's eyes, cold and assessing, watching from the shadows. I woke with the dawn, the gray city light filtering into the sterile apartment, feeling as if I hadn't slept at all. The gilded cage was just as silent and unnerving as it had been the night before. I explored, finding a state-of-the-art kitchen stocked with food I didn't know how to cook, and a bedroom with a closet containing a few sets of new, anonymously stylish clothes in my size. A black silk pajama set, simple trousers, a cashmere sweater. The discovery sent a fresh chill down my spine. This wasn't a spontaneous act of protection. It was a contingency plan. He had been ready for this. The thought was both comforting and deeply unsettling. I spent the morning pacing, a tiger in a $10 million cage, watching the city below wake up and go about its business. My life, my simple, orderly life, had been completely derailed. I was no longer Rita James, maid. I was a protected asset, a piece in a game I didn't understand, waiting for the player to make his next move. It happened around noon. There was no knock, no warning. The private elevator simply opened with a soft chime, and Don Castellano stepped out. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, looking as if he'd just come from a boardroom meeting. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm. "Good morning, Rita," he said, his tone as crisp and businesslike as his attire. "I trust you slept well." "Not particularly," I answered honestly, wrapping my arms around myself. The cashmere of the new sweater was soft, but it offered no real warmth against the coldness in the room. He gave a slight nod, accepting my answer without comment. He wasn't here for pleasantries. "I have an update for you," he said, walking to the large glass dining table. He placed the portfolio down and opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper. He didn't invite me to sit, but I walked over and took a seat opposite him anyway. A small act of defiance. "The contents of your wine glass were sent for analysis at a private lab last night," he began, his eyes on the paper. "The primary agent was a high concentration of zolpidem, mixed with a fast-acting benzodiazepine. It would have rendered you unconscious within 10 to 15 minutes, followed by several hours of memory loss." Hearing the clinical breakdown made my stomach turn. Bile rose in my throat. He had planned it. He had sat across from me, smiling and lying, while he was mere minutes away from what? I pushed the thought away, unable to bear it. Don looked up from the paper, his gaze sharp. "𝘿𝙍𝙎𝙁 is being questioned. My head of security, Luca, is a very persuasive man. 𝘿𝙍𝙎𝙁 is terrified, but he hasn't talked." "He hasn't confessed?" I asked, confused. "Oh, he confessed to drugging the drink within minutes," Don clarified, a hint of steel in his voice. "What he won't do is name the person who gave him the vial and the instructions. His loyalty, it seems, is stronger than his fear of Luca, which makes him more than just a desperate ex-boyfriend. It makes him a soldier." A soldier. The word hung in the air, transforming the pathetic image I had of 𝘿𝙍 into something far more sinister. He wasn't just acting out of his own wounded pride. He was following orders. Don leaned forward slightly, folding his hands on the table. The dynamic in the room shifted. This was no longer an employer speaking to an employee. It wasn't a savior and a victim. It was an intelligence briefing. "I need you to tell me about him, Rita," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "Everything. The man I'm seeing on security footage in my basement is not the same man you dated. Or perhaps he is, and you simply saw a side of him no one else did. I need to understand his weaknesses. I need to know what leverage they have on him." For a moment I bristled. He had spied on me, upended my life, and confined me to this sterile apartment. And now he was demanding I dig up painful memories for his benefit. But then, another thought pushed through the anger. This was my one area of expertise. My knowledge of 𝘿𝙍 wasn't a source of shame or pain anymore. It was a weapon. It was the only thing I possessed that this powerful, all-knowing man actually needed. The realization was a spark of warmth in the frozen landscape of my fear. My knowledge was my defense. I took a deep breath, meeting his gaze directly. "He had debts," I said. "Gambling debts." Don's expression remained neutral, but I saw a flicker of interest in his eyes. "Go on." "It was mostly online poker at first, or that's what he told me. But it got worse. He started talking about a bookie, a shark he called Silas. He was terrified of him. A few months before I left, some men came to the apartment looking for him. They weren't friendly. 𝘿𝙍 was a mess for a week after that, begging me for money. "Did you give it to him?" "Some," I admitted, a familiar wave of shame washing over me. "Enough to make them go away for a little while. It was never enough." "This Silas," Don pressed. "Did you ever get a last name? A description?" I shook my head. "No." 𝘿𝙍 was too scared to even talk about him much. Just that he worked out of a bar on the south side. The Crimson Grotto. Don made a small, almost imperceptible gesture with his hand, and I realized his phone, which sat on the table, was on an open line. He was relaying the information in real time. "What about his associates?" Don asked. "Did his circle of friends change?" I thought back. Yes, about 6 months ago. He dropped all his old friends and started running with a new crew. Flashy guys. They wore cheap suits that they thought looked expensive and had too much cash on them for men with no visible jobs. They were the ones who took him to the Crimson Grotto. "And his mindset?" "Desperate," I said without hesitation. "He was always looking for the one big score. He believed the world owed him something. He resented people with real wealth, people like you. He didn't see success as something to be earned. He saw it as something to be taken." I laid the truth of 𝘿𝙍 bare on that glass table. His weaknesses, his pathetic ambitions, his moral rot, felt like lancing a wound. Painful but necessary. Cleansing. Don listened to every word, his focus absolute. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge. He simply absorbed the information, his mind clearly processing every detail, every angle. When I finished, a long silence settled between us. He finally leaned back in his chair, his amber eyes holding mine. "Thank you, Rita. That was very useful." The simple acknowledgement landed with more force than 1,000 platitudes. It was a sign of respect. He had treated me as an equal, an asset. In his world, that was the highest compliment he could pay. He stood, collecting his portfolio. "What will you do?" I asked, standing as well. "My people will pay a visit to the Crimson Grotto. We will have a conversation with Silas. We will find out who is pulling 𝘿𝙍's strings." He walked toward the elevator, then paused, turning back to me. "You've given me the leverage I needed. Stay here. You are safe. I will update you when there is news." The elevator doors chimed and slid shut, leaving me alone once more. But this time the silence felt different. It was no longer the silence of a cage. It was the quiet of a war room after the strategy has been set. I walked to the window, looking down at the sprawling city. I didn't know who Soldier 𝘿𝙍 was, or why they had targeted me to get to Don Castellano. But I was no longer just a victim caught in the crossfire. I had given them the ammunition, and I found myself needing to see them fire the shot. Ābel is just a pawn in a much deadlier game. Who is he protecting, and why is Rita their real target? For 2 days, the gilded cage remained my world. The city moved on without me, its distant hum a constant reminder of a life that was no longer mine. A member of Don's staff, a silent woman with haunted eyes, brought me fresh clothes and took away the plates of food I'd barely touched. I tried to read the books artfully placed on the shelves, but the words blurred into meaningless shapes. My mind was a coiled spring, wound tight with waiting. My knowledge of Ābel had been the key, but Don Castellano was the one turning it, and I was locked on the other side of the door, listening for the sound of the tumblers falling into place. The chime of the elevator on the 3rd day was a shock to the system. Don stepped out, and the atmosphere in the room immediately crackled with a new intensity. He wasn't just here for an update. He was here with a verdict. He held a thin file in his hand, and his expression was harder, colder than I had ever seen it. "They broke him," I said. "It wasn't a question. We provided him with a compelling reason to reevaluate his allegiances," Don replied, his voice a low, flat baritone. He walked not to the table, but to the great glass window, looking down at the city as if it were a map of his own design. The full analysis of the wine came back this morning. The cocktail of sedatives was potent, but it was the binder agent that proved most interesting. He turned from the window, his amber eyes pinning me in place. It was a specific, custom-synthesized polymer. This chemical signature is unique. It's used to ensure rapid, stable absorption of several compounds at once. There is only one pharmaceutical lab in the Midwest with the equipment to produce it, a boutique operation called Viridia Labs. He paused, letting the name hang in the air. Viridia Labs is a subsidiary of a holding company which, after digging through 5 layers of shell corporations, is owned entirely by the Moretti family. The name landed like a punch to the gut. Even a maid in the Castellano household knew who the Morettis were. They were the rivals, the other power in the city's underworld. The Castellanos were old world, built on structure and a twisted code of honor. The Morettis were new money predators, flashy, ruthless, and hungry. The two families circled each other in a cold war that occasionally flared hot in the city's dark corners. "So the drug, it's a fingerprint," I whispered, understanding the true significance of the evidence. "A fingerprint, a signature, and a death warrant," Don said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I had Luca present this information to Ābel an hour ago. We didn't show him photos or witness statements. We showed him a single page, the chemical breakdown of the compound and the supply chain report linking it directly to Carmine Moretti's primary chemist. We explained that his attempt on you was no longer a simple assault charge. It was an act of war, and he was the detonator. His testimony was the only thing that might save him from being disposed of as a liability by both sides. Ābel's carefully constructed wall of loyalty had crumbled to dust. "He told us everything," Don continued, finally moving to the table and placing the file down. "He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The information was seared into his memory. His gambling debts were not just to a bookie. They were directly to the Moretti organization. Over $200,000. They owned him. They gave him an ultimatum. Clear his debt in service, or his family would pay it for him in blood. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was so much bigger, so much uglier than a pathetic, controlling ex-boyfriend. "His service," Don said, his voice dropping, "was you." He let the silence stretch, forcing me to confront the cold, hard reality. The plan was not sophisticated, but it was vicious. Ābel was to incapacitate you at the Belmont Club. He was to take you from the premises to a secondary location, a hotel room the Morettis had already secured. There, he was to photograph you. The clinical word was 1,000 times more brutal than any profanity. The room tilted, the glittering skyline outside the window blurring into a sickening smear of light. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. The violation he had planned was not one of passion or obsession. It was a business transaction, Those photographs, Don went on, his voice an icy scalpel, would have been delivered to me by a third party. They would have come with a price for their destruction and silence. The Morettas don't want money. They want power. They want my shipping interests at the port of Chicago. It all clicked into place. The expensive wine, the public setting, Abel's desperation, it was all a calculated performance. I wasn't the object of his obsession. I was the leverage. A maid in the Castellano household, someone they assumed was insignificant enough to be a soft target, but whose violation would be a direct insult to the honor of the family Don commanded. An attack on his people was an attack on him, and the Morettas knew it. I looked at Don, seeing the grim understanding in his eyes. He knew this world, its cruel logic, its casual brutality. He had known, from the moment he saw that vial, that this was more than a domestic dispute. The fear I felt was no longer the sharp, personal fear of a woman escaping an abusive ex. It was a vast, formless terror. I had stumbled out of a shallow pond and fallen into the deep ocean. Sharks were circling, and I was the bait. So this is a mob war? I asked, the words feeling ridiculous and cinematic on my tongue. It is a negotiation, Don corrected me, his gaze never wavering. And the Morettas have just made a very aggressive opening offer. They used your ex-boyfriend as a pawn to try and take one of my most valuable assets. He took a step closer, his presence filling the room. They made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed you were just a pawn. His words were meant to be reassuring, to imply I was more than that to him, but all I could hear was the truth. I was a pawn. A pawn he had just decided to move to a more strategic square. My life, my safety, my body, it had all been reduced to a bargaining chip in a territorial dispute between criminals. I was no longer Rita James. I was the unwilling centerpiece in a war I never knew existed. The words settled in the space between us, heavy and cold as granite. A pawn. It was the truth, stripped bare of any comforting illusion. My life had been a series of random chances and small choices, but now I saw it for what it was. A domino, tipped over by forces I couldn't see, setting off a chain reaction that had led me to this room, this man, this terrifying new reality. My breath hitched. The fear was a living thing inside me, a cold serpent coiling in my gut. I wasn't just scared of what the Morettas might do. I was terrified of what I had become in their eyes, in his eyes. I was an object, a piece of leverage, a name in a negotiation. Don watched me, his face an unreadable mask, but his eyes were different. The cold, strategic light I'd seen before was gone, replaced by something deeper, something that looked almost like regret. He saw my terror, saw the way I was trying to hold myself together, my knuckles white where I gripped the back of a chair. They miscalculated, he said again, his voice softer this time, losing its hard, clinical edge. They see a maid an easy target, a weakness to be exploited. He took a step away from the window, closing the distance between us. They made that mistake because they don't know who you are, Rita. But I do. I looked up at him, my confusion momentarily overriding my fear. You don't know anything about me. A long, quiet moment passed. He seemed to be weighing a decision of immense gravity. The air in the penthouse grew thick with unspoken history. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, imbued with a weariness that seemed to come from a place far deeper than the events of the last few days. Tell me about your father, he said. The question was so unexpected it felt like a physical blow. My father, I stammered. What does he have to do with any of this? Everything, Don said simply. What did your mother tell you about his death? I felt a pang of old, familiar grief. It was a story I'd recited my whole life. A clean, tragic narrative to explain an absence that had defined me. There was a robbery at his office. He was an accountant, he worked late. He fought back. It was a mugging gone wrong. Don held my gaze, and in his eyes, I saw a profound sadness. That's the story you were meant to believe, he said gently. It was the story we told your mother. A necessary lie to keep you both safe. My blood ran cold. What are you talking about? Your father's name was Marco James, Don began, his voice taking on the quality of a eulogy. And he wasn't just any accountant. For 15 years, he was the lead accountant for the Castellano family. He was a man of immense integrity and quiet courage. He was my father's most trusted civilian employee. My mind struggled to process the words. My father, a quiet man who I remembered only in faded photographs, had worked for the Mafia? About 12 years ago, Don continued, your father found something. Small discrepancies at first, then a clear pattern. A river of money being siphoned from our shipping operations. He followed the trail, and it led him to a man named Silvio Gallo, one of my father's underbosses. Gallo was running an embezzlement scheme, stealing from the family. He paused, his jaw tightening at the memory. Your father, being the man he was, did not look the other way. He gathered the evidence, every last damning ledger, and he brought it to my father. He did the right thing, the honorable thing. What happened? I whispered, my throat tight. Gallo found out that Marco was the one who had exposed him. Before my father could put your family under proper protection, Gallo acted. He sent 2 men. They didn't just want the ledgers, they wanted to send a message. They staged it to look like a robbery, a random act of street violence. Don's voice was raw with an old anger. It wasn't random, Rita. It was an execution. Your father died protecting the honor of my family. The world fractured. The simple, tragic story of my life shattered into a million pieces. My father wasn't a victim of chance. He was a hero, a man murdered for his principles. The grief I felt was sharp and new, a sudden, blinding pain for the man I never truly knew. After your father's death, Don went on, his voice softer now, my father felt the weight of that failure until the day he died. He had failed to protect a loyal man. When I took his place, that debt became mine. My mind raced, connecting impossible dots. The pension my mother received every month. A check from a defunct accounting firm she'd never been able to explain. The way we never seemed to struggle, even when times were hard. The pension, I breathed. From that company. That was you? He nodded. It was the least I could do. A way to honor his sacrifice without putting you and your mother in further danger by making the connection obvious. I kept a distant watch over you both. I knew where you went to school, where you worked. I knew when you met Abel, and I knew when you finally found the strength to leave him. His gaze was intense, unwavering. When my head of staff mentioned a maid's position was opening up, and I knew you were looking for stable work after leaving Abel, it wasn't a coincidence that your application was selected. I brought you to the estate, Rita. I brought you here because it was the one place in this city where I could guarantee you were safe. I sank onto the sofa, my legs no longer able to support me. My entire life, every major turn, had been quietly orchestrated by the man standing before me. The stability I had cherished, the peace I thought I had built for myself. It had all been a carefully constructed illusion, a gilded cage I hadn't even known I was in. But beneath the shock, something else was taking root. A profound, staggering sense of connection. This man, this powerful, dangerous stranger, had been my silent guardian. He had carried the weight of my father's death as a personal debt. He hadn't intervened at the Belmont Club just to protect an employee or an asset. He had done it to protect Marco's daughter. Tears streamed down my face. For my father, for my mother, for the life I thought I knew. Don didn't move. He simply stood there, a silent sentinel, giving me the space to let the truth settle. The chasm between us, of employer and employee, of mafia boss and maid, had vanished. In its place was a bond, forged in a tragedy 12 years old and sealed in the violence of the last few days. I was no longer just a pawn in his game. I was a part of its history. I was my father's legacy. The revelation about my father changed everything. It was a key, turning the lock on a past I never knew I had. The penthouse, once a symbol of my confinement, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where the son of the man my father died for was keeping me safe from a world of shadows. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had a new companion, a fragile, burgeoning sense of purpose. I was not just a random victim. I was Marco James's daughter. That name meant something in this house, in this world. And that meant I had to mean something, too. The call came on the fourth day. It wasn't Don's voice, but Luca's, his tone clipped and professional. A car will be waiting for you in 20 minutes. Mr. Castellano requests your presence at the estate. The ride back was a study in contrasts. I sat in the same leather seat, drove the same familiar roads, but I was not the same woman who had left. I wasn't a maid returning to her duties. I was an asset being summoned to the war room. As we passed through the grand iron gates of the Castellano estate, my old life felt a million miles away. Don was waiting for me in his study, a room I had only ever dusted. It was the heart of his power, a space of dark wood, worn leather, and the faint, pleasant scent of old books and whiskey. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. He stood by the window, a silhouette against the gray afternoon light. "Carmine Moretti is coming here," he said without preamble. He requested the meeting. He will feign outrage, deny everything, and demand the release of Abel. My stomach tightened. The name Moretti was no longer an abstract threat. It was a physical presence about to invade this safe haven. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. Don turned to face me fully. His expression was calm, his focus absolute. "Because you are going to be in this room when he arrives." My heart hammered against my ribs. "And," he continued, his gaze unwavering, "you are going to serve us drinks." The words hit me like a splash of ice water. A cold, familiar humiliation washed over me. After everything, the revelations, the shared history, the trust, was he just putting me back in my place? Reminding me that, in the end, I was still just the help? He must have seen the flash of hurt and confusion on my face, because he took a step closer. "Listen to me very carefully, Rita. Your role in what is about to happen is the most important one in the room. Moretti believes he is walking into the lion's den to negotiate. In truth, he is walking into a trap. You will bring in the tray. You will pour the drinks. You will not speak unless I speak to you. You will be, for all intents and purposes, invisible. Do you understand?" I looked into his eyes and saw it then. This wasn't a slight. It was a strategy. A cold, calculated move on a chessboard I was only just beginning to understand. He was trusting me to play my part. "I understand," I said. An hour later, I stood by a service table just outside the study, my hands resting on a heavy silver tray bearing a crystal decanter of whiskey and 2 glasses. My maid's uniform was gone, replaced by a simple, elegant black dress provided by the silent housekeeper. I was a ghost of my former self playing a role. I heard the commotion of their arrival, the crunch of tires on gravel, the low rumble of unfamiliar voices. Then, the heavy oak door of the study opened, and I heard him. "This is an outrage, Donald. Holding my man. Making accusations. You have gone too far." Carmine Moretti's voice was exactly as I'd imagined. Loud, gravelly, and slick with false indignation. He strode into the room, a man in his late 50s with slicked-back silver hair and a suit that was too expensive to be tasteful. He was followed by 2 mountains of muscle who remained by the door, their eyes sweeping the room. He was a peacock, all bluster and bright feathers, a stark contrast to Don's coiled, silent power. Don remained seated behind his massive desk. "Your man was caught attempting to drug a member of my staff in a public establishment, Carmine. I'd say he is the one who has gone too far." "A misunderstanding," Moretti spat, waving a dismissive hand. "The boy was emotional. A lover's quarrel. You know how it is. It's a personal matter, nothing to do with us. You have no right to hold him." Don let the silence stretch for a long moment before pressing a small, discreet button on his desk. It was my cue. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and entered the lion's den. I kept my eyes downcast, my movements quiet and efficient, just as I had 1,000 times before. I moved to the low table in front of the leather chairs, my focus entirely on the decanter and the glasses. The air was thick with tension, a palpable thing I could feel on my skin. I was aware of Moretti's gaze on me, a quick, dismissive appraisal. I poured Don's drink first, then turned to him. "Mr. Moretti?" He sneered, a look of utter contempt on his face as he looked from me to Don. "You cannot be serious," he scoffed. "You would risk a war between our families, disrupt a decades-long peace, over this?" He waved a hand in my direction, as if shooing away a fly. "Over a maid? She is not worth the conflict, Donald. Let the boy go, and we can forget this unfortunate business." It was the opening. The trap had been sprung. Don Castellano leaned forward, a predator who had just seen his prey step on the trigger plate. The calm demeanor vanished, replaced by a chillingly cold precision. "This was never about a lover's quarrel, Carmine," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. He slid a thin file across the polished surface of his desk. "And it was never about a maid. It's about your chemist." Moretti's bravado faltered. He picked up the file, his eyes scanning the first page. I saw the blood drain from his face, the confident sneer replaced by a flicker of pure, animal panic. He was looking at the chemical analysis of the wine, the unbreakable chain of evidence that led directly back to Viridia Labs. "And to be clear about the nature of this unfortunate business," Don continued, his voice like ice, "it wasn't a single event." He turned his gaze to me. For the first time, he spoke my name in front of an outsider. "Rita, tell Mr. Moretti, if you would, about the phone calls." My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my voice, when it came, was clear and steady. I looked directly at Carmine Moretti, who was now staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. "He called the main estate line 17 times in the month before the incident," I said. "He tried to get my schedule from the kitchen staff. He waited by the service entrance on multiple occasions. I filed a restraining order against him 3 weeks ago. Each sentence was a nail in Abel's coffin and Moretti's. I wasn't reciting facts. I was testifying. I was establishing a clear, deliberate pattern of harassment and stalking, a sustained campaign by a Moretti soldier, targeting a Castellano employee on Castellano territory. It was no longer a personal matter. It was a direct and calculated insult to Don's authority and his entire family. Moretti was trapped, outmaneuvered. The evidence was absolute, my testimony irrefutable. He had no moves left. Don leaned back in his chair, the picture of calm, lethal control. "So you see, Carmine, I am not holding your man. I am holding a piece of evidence. A loose end. One I'm sure you'd like to see tied up." He let the threat hang in the air. "You will cut him loose. He is a ghost. As reparations for this profound insult to my house, your interests at the port will be dissolved by the end of the month. They are mine now." Defeat was a bitter pill, but Carmine Moretti was a survivor. He swallowed it. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He stood, his face a mask of controlled fury, and walked out of the room without another word, his thugs trailing behind him like beaten dogs. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving Don and me alone in the sudden, ringing silence. The adrenaline slowly began to recede, leaving me trembling. I had faced down a monster, and I hadn't flinched. Don rose from his desk and walked over to me. He stood before me, his expression unreadable, but his eyes filled with a deep, quiet respect. "You were the weapon, Rita," he said softly. "The one they never saw coming." And in that moment I understood. I wasn't just a maid. I wasn't a pawn or a victim. In the heart of the lion's den, I had been the lioness. Rita just faced down a rival crime boss and emerged victorious. Her transformation from maid to player is just beginning. Please subscribe if you haven't, also like and share. Now please continue to find out what her new role in the Castellano Empire will be. The silence that followed Carmine Moretti's departure was heavier than any sound. It was the silence of a battlefield after the victor has been decided. I stood in the center of the study, the silver tray forgotten in my hands, my own reflection a pale, wavering ghost in its polished surface. Don walked to the decanter I had used, pouring himself another measure of whiskey. He didn't offer me one. The lines of our old roles hadn't been erased, but they had been redrawn into a map I couldn't yet read. "You're not going back to the penthouse," he said, his back to me as he stared into the fire. "It's a safe house. This is your home now. Your safety is no longer a matter of containment. It's a matter of proximity." My home. The word felt foreign, too large for my mouth. He turned, his amber eyes catching the firelight. "You are the daughter of Marco James. You are a ward of the Castellano family. Your place is here." He gestured to the room, to the house beyond it. "Luca will have your things moved from your old apartment and the penthouse to the blue suite in the East Wing. You will want for nothing." And just like that, my life was irrevocably changed. I wasn't fired. I wasn't a temporary guest. I was something else. Permanent fixture. A known quantity. The next few days were a masterclass in quiet awkwardness. The staff, my former colleagues, treated me with a new, baffling deference. Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper who had once chided me for leaving streaks on a window pane, now asked me what I would prefer for my meals. The other maids would fall silent when I entered a room, their eyes a mixture of curiosity, envy, and fear. I was a ghost haunting the halls of my old life, no longer one of them, but not yet one of them either. I was adrift in a social no man's land, and the loneliness was sharper than I could have imagined. My only anchor was Don. He seemed to understand the strangeness of my new position. He didn't assign me duties, but he also didn't leave me to wander the grand, empty rooms alone. On the third morning, Luca appeared at the door of my suite. "Mr. Castellano requests your presence in the boardroom in 5 minutes." The boardroom was a place I had only ever cleaned in the dead of night. It was an intimidating space, dominated by a long, polished mahogany table that could seat 20. Today, only a handful of men were present. Don at the head, Luca to his right, and 2 other severe-looking men I recognized as Castellano capos. They all rose when I entered, a gesture of respect that sent a fresh wave of disorientation through me. "Rita," Don said, his voice all business. "Please." He indicated the chair directly to his left, the seat of an advisor. My heart hammered against my ribs as I took the seat. A map of the port of Chicago was spread across the table, dotted with markers and notations. "We are discussing the absorption of the Moretti assets at the port," Don explained, for my benefit. "The transfer of title is complete. Now comes the matter of logistics, personnel, warehousing, and transport." For the next hour I listened. I was a silent observer as they spoke a language of tonnage, shipping lanes, and union kickbacks. They were efficient, ruthless, and brilliant. They carved up Moretti's operation like a carcass, leaving nothing to chance. But as they spoke, I noticed a recurring problem. The Moretti foremen are all loyalists. One of the capos, a man named Sal, grumbled, "There'll be a cancer in the operation. They'll encourage slowdowns, sabotage shipments. We should clean house, replace them all with our own people." "It would take months to train a new crew of that size," Luca countered. "Productivity would plummet. We need a smoother transition." They argued the point back and forth, focused on assets and power, on loyalty and threats. But they were missing the most obvious piece of the puzzle. They were all soldiers thinking about a battle. I was a maid who had spent her life watching people. Don must have seen something in my expression. He turned his head slightly, his gaze questioning. "You have a thought, Rita?" Every eye in the room swiveled to me. The silence was absolute. My old self, the girl who kept her head down and her opinions to herself, screamed at me to stay quiet. But that girl was gone. I cleared my throat, my voice sounding small in the vast room. "They aren't just loyalists," I said, looking at the map but speaking to Don. "They're men who just watched their boss get dismantled. Their whole world has been turned upside down. They aren't just loyal. They're scared." I finally lifted my gaze, meeting Don's. "You can't control scared men with threats. You can't buy them with money. But you can give them something Moretti never did." "And what's that?" Sal asked, his tone skeptical. "Stability," I said simply. "Moretti was a shark. He bled his people. You know this. If Mr. Castellano were to go down there himself, not with soldiers but with a promise a promise to honor their contracts, to increase their hazard pay, to guarantee their jobs aren't just safe but better under his leadership. You wouldn't just be replacing a boss. You would be performing a rescue. Scared men don't want to fight. They want a safe harbor. The room was silent. I expected to be dismissed, to be told I didn't understand their world. But Luca was looking at me with a newfound respect. Sal was stroking his chin, a thoughtful frown on his face. And Don was looking at me with an intensity that had nothing to do with business. It was a look of profound, undisguised appreciation. A rescue, he repeated softly, testing the word. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. An excellent observation, Miss James. From that day on, the lines blurred completely. I was no longer just an observer. I was a contributor. Don began asking for my opinion on other matters, things that had nothing to do with logistics and everything to do with people. He valued my perspective, the outsider's view that saw the human element his men often missed. I was intelligent, he said, but more than that, I was observant. I saw the gears, not just the machine. Our evenings fell into a new rhythm. After the business of the day was done, he would find me in the library. We would sit by the fire, a glass of wine for me, a whiskey for him, and we would talk. The professional respect began to deepen into something more personal, more intimate. A simmering, unspoken attraction crackled in the space between us. I saw the man behind the formidable Don. A man with the weight of an empire on his shoulders. A man who possessed a quiet loneliness that mirrored my own. One night, as we sat in the comfortable silence, he reached across the small table between us, his fingers lightly brushing mine as he adjusted the position of my wine glass. The touch was electric, a jolt that went straight to my core. Our eyes met over the flickering flames, and the air grew thick with everything we weren't saying. The rigid lines of employer and employee, of protector and protected, had dissolved completely. What was left was just a man and a woman, bound by a shared history of violence and a future that was as terrifying as it was tantalizing. A month passed. It was a month of strange dualities, of living in a world I both belonged to and was entirely separate from. By day, I was a quiet shadow in the Castellano Empire, my insights proving valuable in meetings where men twice my age planned moves that would ripple through the city's underworld. By night, I was a resident of the Grand Estate, sharing quiet moments with Don in the library, the space between us charged with an unspoken current that grew stronger with each passing day. Our relationship was a delicate, unacknowledged thing, a fragile truce between two worlds. And then it was over, or so I thought. The summons came not as an invitation, but as a command. Luca appeared at my door, his face as impassive as ever. Don Castellano will see you in the library. Now. The casual warmth of our evenings vanished, replaced by a chilling formality that I hadn't felt since the day I arrived. My heart plummeted. This was it. The bill for my strange, improbable new life had come due. I was a complication, a loose thread in the tightly woven tapestry of his world. I had been a useful asset, a debt to be repaid, but the debt was settled, and the asset was now a liability. A complication to be managed and, eventually, removed. I walked the long, silent halls of the East Wing, the sound of my own footsteps echoing like a funeral drum. Every shared look, every quiet conversation by the fire, replayed in my mind not as a budding connection, but as a prolonged and foolish miscalculation on my part. I had allowed myself to forget what he was, and more importantly, what I was: a maid, the daughter of an accountant, a girl who had stumbled into a kingdom where she did not belong. The heavy oak doors of the library were closed. I hesitated, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the handle. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. He wasn't by the fire. He was standing behind his massive desk, the same position he had taken the day he'd faced down Carmine Moretti. The desk lamp carved him out of the shadows, casting his face in sharp, unforgiving lines. He looked every inch the Mafia Don, a man of absolute power. The friend I had come to know in the quiet hours of the night was gone. "Rita," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth I had grown accustomed to. "Close the door." I did as I was told, the click of the latch sounding like a cell door locking into place. I stood before his desk, feeling small and out of place, a petitioner before a king. "It has been 1 month since the incident at the Belmont Club," he began, his voice all business. My stomach clenched. This was it. He was laying the groundwork for my dismissal, reminding me of the chaos I had brought into his world. "I have been meaning to discuss the particulars of that night with you," he continued, his gaze intense. "There are details you are unaware of." I braced myself. "I know what happened." "You know what you saw," he corrected me, his voice dangerously quiet. "But you don't know why it was possible for me to see it. You think it was a coincidence, my being there that night." I frowned, confused. "You were having a business meeting." A flicker of something, a deep, profound emotion I couldn't name, passed through his eyes. I was. But the location was not a coincidence. Nor was the outcome. He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle in the air before he spoke them. "I bought the Belmont Club the day after you told my housekeeper you had agreed to meet Able there." The world tilted on its axis. My mind reeled, struggling to comprehend the sheer scale of what he was saying. "I had my security team install a new, state-of-the-art surveillance system throughout the main lounge and all exits," he went on, his voice a low, steady rumble. "The cameras were fed to a private monitor in the booth where I was sitting. I watched every second, from the moment you walked in. I saw the vial in his hand before he even took it out of his pocket. There was never a possibility, not even for a second, that you would drink from that glass." I stared at him, speechless. The entire event, the moment that had shattered my life and rebuilt it into something new, hadn't been a near miss. It had been a controlled demolition. He had built a stage, set with cameras and security, and allowed the drama to play out, all while holding the strings. He had given me the space to face my demon, to prove to myself that I was strong, but he had done so from within the walls of a fortress he had built around me without my knowledge. "Why?" I finally whispered, the word barely audible. It was then that the cold, hard mask of the dawn finally cracked. The weariness returned to his eyes, the profound weight of his world. He walked around the desk, closing the distance between us until he was standing only a few feet away. "Because of your father," he said, his voice raw with an emotion I had never heard from him before. "The debt I owed him wasn't just financial, Rita. It was a debt of honor. My father failed to protect him, and for 12 years I have carried that failure. Watching you, from a distance, I saw his integrity, his quiet strength. When you came to work here, that sense of duty, it became something else. Something personal." He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the full, unguarded truth in his eyes. "You were never just a maid to me, Rita. You were a responsibility I couldn't ignore. But in this past month, watching you, listening to you, you stopped being a debt. You became someone I respect. Someone I trust more than most of the men in my organization." He stopped, his confession hanging in the charged air between us. This was the true revelation, more stunning than any business deal or hidden camera. It was the bearing of his soul. "And that is why I have brought you here," he said, his voice regaining a measure of its formal strength. "To give you a choice. Your old life is gone. You can never go back to being just a maid, here or anywhere else. The Morettas know your face now. You are part of this world, whether you wish to be or not." He laid out my future like 2 cards on a table. "The first choice is this: you can remain here at the estate as a permanent ward of the Castellano family. You will continue to be my employee, but your duties will be undefined. Your salary will be tripled. You will be protected, safe, and want for nothing. You will be comfortable, but you will be kept separate from the business. You will be safe, but you will be on the outside." He paused, his gaze searching mine. "Or," he said, his voice dropping, becoming more intense, "you can accept a formal position as my personal assistant, my confidant. You would have full knowledge of my operations. You would stand at my side, not behind me. You would be in the inner circle. It is a position of trust, of power, and of immense danger. You would no longer be on the outside. You would be all the way in." He had laid his kingdom at my feet and asked me to choose my place in it. I could be a protected treasure, locked away in a gilded cage. Or I could be the Queen's bishop, a powerful piece in the most dangerous game in the city, standing beside the king. My past, my future, and the ghost of my father all seemed to converge in this one breathtaking moment, waiting for my answer. The two choices hung in the air between us, shimmering and distinct as a mirage. One was a path of quiet comfort, of safety bought at the price of invisibility. It was the life of a protected treasure, beautiful and silent behind reinforced glass. It was, I realized with a sudden, chilling clarity, the life my mother had lived, a life of quiet dignity, but one lived in the long shadow of a man's choices. It was a gilded cage, and I had spent the last month learning the true meaning of that phrase. The other path was a cliff edge, a road of power and danger, of walking into the fire with my eyes wide open. It offered no guarantees of safety, only a guarantee of significance. It was a seat at the table where the fate of empires, however small and dark, was decided. My past self, the girl who had smoothed down her yellow dress in the lobby of the Belmont Club, would have taken the first choice without hesitation. She craved safety. She longed for peace. She had spent her life trying to be invisible, believing it was the only way to survive. But I had looked Carmine Moretti in the eye and watched his bluster crumble into dust. I had sat in the boardroom and offered a perspective that these powerful men had missed. I had been a weapon, a confidant, and a strategist. The taste of that significance, of that agency, was something I now knew I could not live without. Don hadn't just saved me from 𝘍𝙍𝙎𝙎. He had saved me from the small, quiet life I had mistaken for peace. I looked at him, at the man who had been my shadow protector, my employer, my captor, and now my kingmaker. I saw the weight of his world in his eyes, and for the first time I wasn't afraid of it. I wanted to help him carry it. My choice was not a choice at all. It was an acceptance of the woman I had become. "I'm done being invisible," I said, my voice clear and steady in the quiet of the library. The words felt like a vow, a declaration of independence that came from a place deeper and stronger than my confrontation with 𝘍𝙍𝙎𝙎. I took a step closer, closing the final distance between us. I was no longer a petitioner standing before his desk. I was his equal, meeting him in the center of the room. "I will accept the second position," I said. "On one condition." A flicker of surprise crossed his features. He had offered me the world, and I was countering with terms. "I will not be a fragile asset to be guarded," I stated, my gaze locked with his. "I will not be a piece you move around the board for my own protection. If I am to be in your inner circle, I do it as a partner in my own defense. I will be trained. I will be informed. I will be armed, not just with knowledge, but with whatever skills are necessary to survive in your world. I will not be your ward, Don. I will be your ally." The silence stretched, thick with the audacity of my demand. I had not just asked for a seat at the table. I had demanded the right to help defend it. For a long moment, Don Castellano simply looked at me. He saw not the maid, not the victim, not even the accountant's daughter. He saw the woman who had faced down his rival, the strategist who had seen the humanity his soldiers had missed. He saw the lioness. And then, for the first time since I had known him, a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It was not the ghost of a smile or a flicker of amusement. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated respect. A smile that transformed his hard, severe features into something else entirely. It was a smile that reached his eyes, warming their amber depths. "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. 3 weeks later, the boardroom felt different. It was no longer an intimidating space I had stumbled into, but a familiar one. The scent of coffee and the low murmur of conversation were the sounds of my new life. Luca, Sal, and the other capos were already seated, their thick files open before them. They nodded as I entered, the gesture now one of comfortable, earned respect. I wore a tailored navy blue suit, the sharp lines a stark contrast to the soft yellow dress I had once worn. My hair was pulled back in a sleek, professional style. I was no longer a ghost haunting the edges of this world. I was a part of its architecture. I walked to the head of the table and took my seat, the one directly to Don's right. He entered a moment later, his presence commanding the room to an immediate, focused silence. He gave me a brief, affirming nod before taking his own seat. "Let's begin," he said. "The situation at the docks requires a delicate touch." As Luca began his report, I opened my own file, my mind already sifting through the logistics, the personnel issues, the potential threats. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Later that evening, back in the quiet sanctuary of my suite, I stood before a new piece of art that hung on the wall. It was a large, shadow box frame, elegantly crafted. Inside, against a backing of black silk, was the yellow dress. It was no longer just a piece of clothing. It was a relic, a monument. It wasn't a reminder of the night I was almost a victim, but a testament to the night I found my power. It was the chrysalis I had shed to become something new. It was the uniform of my last day as an invisible woman. I looked at it not with trauma or fear, but with a quiet, steely sense of triumph. I was Rita James, the accountant's daughter, and I had taken my seat at the table. Rita's journey from the shadows to the throne has just begun. If you loved this story of danger, loyalty, and empowerment, don't miss the next installment of the Castellano Chronicles.